Beneath the frozen forests of Scandinavia, 282 steel beasts prowled the snow-covered ranges, their crews trained to perfection, their guns loaded and ready. Yet in 6 years of the world's deadliest conflict, not one Swedish Strv M/42 tank ever faced an enemy in battle. Not a single shot fired in anger, not one crew blooded by war. This is the story of a weapon built for a war that never came, a tank that trained an army but never fought one, and a machine so thoroughly forgotten that even military historians struggle to recall its name. September 1939. The German Wehrmacht smashes into Poland with a new doctrine that will change warfare forever. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. At the spearhead, hundreds of panzers roll across the Polish plains, and the world watches in horror as an entire nation falls in just 36 days. In Stockholm, Swedish military planners stare at maps with growing dread. Denmark shares a narrow strait with southern Sweden. Norway stretches along their entire western border. Finland fights desperately to the east. And Germany, the most powerful military machine ever assembled, dominates the Baltic Sea. Sweden has maintained armed neutrality for over a century, but neutrality without strength is merely an invitation. The Swedish army counts its armored vehicles, 72 Stridsvagn M/21 tanks, based on a German design from World War I. Light reconnaissance vehicles, training machines, utterly obsolete against modern panzers. If the Wehrmacht decides Swedish iron ore is worth taking by force, nothing can stop them, nothing. The Swedish government makes a decision that will define their defense policy for generations. They will build their own tanks. Not import them, not license them. Build them from Swedish steel, powered by Swedish engines, armed with Swedish guns in Swedish factories. But there is a problem. Sweden has never designed a medium tank before. They have no blueprints, no experience with modern armored warfare. And the world is already at war, which means the great powers are hoarding their military secrets like gold. Swedish engineers study what intelligence they can gather, reports from Poland, photographs from France, technical specifications leaked through neutral channels. They analyze the German Panzer III, the Czech 38T, even the Soviet T-26. What emerges is a distinctly Swedish solution to an impossible problem. They will build a medium tank optimized not for the vast steppes of Russia or the open deserts of North Africa, but for the dense forests and narrow roads of Scandinavia. In 1940, the design work begins in earnest at Landsverk, a Swedish engineering firm in the city of Landskrona. The lead engineer, Otto Merker, is himself a German expatriate who fled the Nazi regime. His team faces constraints that would cripple most tank programs. Sweden has no domestic high-velocity tank gun. They have limited supplies of armor-grade steel. Their industrial capacity is a fraction of the major powers. Yet they persist. The design that takes shape on their drafting tables is compact, practical, and achievable. They designate it Stridsvagn M/42, Combat Vehicle Model 42. The hull is entirely riveted construction. Welding technology remains underdeveloped in Swedish factories, so thousands of rivets hold the armor plates together. This is old-fashioned even by 1942 standards, but it allows rapid production using existing equipment. The armor itself is modest by German or Soviet standards. Maximum thickness reaches just 50 millimeters on the front glacis, angled at a reasonable slope for deflection. The sides are 20 millimeters, the rear just 15, against anti-tank rifles and light cannons, adequate. Against modern 75 millimeter guns, inadequate. The suspension system draws heavily from Czech designs, specifically the 38T tank that Germany has captured and put into mass production. 4 large road wheels per side, paired on 2 bogies with leaf spring suspension, simple, reliable, easy to maintain in the field. The tracks are relatively narrow at 360 millimeters, which limits mobility in deep snow but reduces ground pressure on frozen lakes. A critical consideration for a Swedish tank that might need to cross ice-covered waterways during winter operations. Power comes from a Scania-Vabis L603 engine, a Swedish-built inline-six developing 142 horsepower. The engine is underpowered for a tank approaching 23 metric tons, but Swedish diesel technology in 1942 cannot produce anything stronger. Maximum road speed reaches 43 km per hour on flat terrain. In practice, through Swedish forests, half that range is 180 kilometers, acceptable for defensive operations but limited for extended maneuvers. The armament represents the greatest compromise. Sweden has no indigenous 75mm tank gun. Instead, the Strv M/42 mounts a Bofors 75mm M/37 gun, Originally designed as an infantry support weapon and field artillery piece, it is not a dedicated anti-tank weapon. The barrel length is only 22.5 calibers, making it stubby and low velocity by the standards of 1942. Muzzle velocity barely exceeds 450 meters per second against the frontal armor of a German Panzer IV, questionable; against a Panther, hopeless; but against fortifications, infantry positions, and light vehicles, effective enough. A coaxial 8mm machine gun provides close defense. The turret is manually traversed, no hydraulics, no electric motors, just the crew commander and gunner grinding the handwheel to rotate 14 tons of turret and gun. In combat this would prove agonizingly slow, but Swedish doctrine does not envision tank versus tank duels at speed. They envision defensive ambushes in forest clearings, prepared positions along roadways, pre-sighted firing lanes where the enemy comes to you. Production begins in 1942 at Landsverk and Karlstad's Mekaniska Werkstatt. The first vehicles roll off the assembly lines in December. The pace accelerates through 1943 and 44. By the time the last Strvm/42 is completed in 1944, Swedish factories have delivered 282 examples. For a small neutral nation with limited industrial capacity, building nearly 300 medium tanks in 3 years represents an extraordinary achievement. More than Switzerland, more than Spain, more than most nations caught in the crossfire of global war. The Swedish army organizes these tanks into battalions, trains crews, develops tactics, and prepares for an invasion that fortune, diplomacy, and geography will ensure never comes. The crews train relentlessly. Through the pine forests of Norrland, across the frozen lakes of Värmland, along the coastal roads where German invasion would most likely strike. Swedish tankers learn to fight from ambush positions. They practice camouflage discipline, concealing their vehicles beneath pine branches and winter netting. They drill on firing from hold-down positions where only the turret is exposed. They rehearse withdrawing along pre-planned routes, using Sweden's limited road network to channel any invader into killing zones. By 1944, Swedish tank battalions are as well trained as any force in Europe, but training is not war. April 1940. Germany invades Denmark and Norway in a single coordinated strike. Swedish neutrality hangs by a thread. The Strvm/42 does not yet exist, not even as a prototype. Swedish border units watch helplessly as Wehrmacht columns roll through their neighbors, but Hitler makes a calculation. Swedish iron ore flows more reliably from a neutral Sweden than an occupied one. The panzers do not turn east, the invasion never comes. 1941. Operation Barbarossa explodes across the Soviet frontier. 3 million German soldiers drive toward Moscow. Sweden allows German troop trains to transit Swedish railways. It is a humiliating compromise, a stain on Swedish neutrality, but it keeps the Wehrmacht pointed away from Stockholm. The first Strvm/42 tanks are still being designed. The war continues without them. 1942 and 43, the tide turns. Stalingrad, Kursk, El Alamein. Germany begins its long retreat. Sweden quietly shifts its policy, reduces cooperation with Berlin, strengthens ties with the Allies. The Strvm/42 enters production just as the strategic threat begins to recede. By 1944, when Swedish factories are churning out these tanks at maximum rate, the possibility of German invasion has virtually disappeared. The 282 steel beasts patrol Swedish borders, watching a war that rages everywhere except on Swedish soil. Not one combat engagement, not one shot fired at an enemy. The Strvm/42 serves through the end of World War II without ever fulfilling its design purpose. Some might call this failure. Swedish mothers who never became widows call it success. Against its contemporaries, the Strvm/42 would have struggled desperately. Consider the German Panzer IV OSFH in production the same year. 80mm frontal armor versus 50. A high-velocity 75mm L/48 gun with a muzzle velocity over 700 meters per second versus the Swedish gun, barely managing 450. Electric turret traverse versus manual cranking. In any direct engagement, the Panzer IV wins decisively. The Swedish tank would need ambush, surprise, and fortune just to survive. The Soviet T-34 presents an even grimmer comparison. Sloped armor up to 60mm thick, angled so effectively it defeats guns much larger than what the Strvm/42 carries. a powerful 500 horsepower diesel engine giving superior mobility, a proven combat record across thousands of battles. The T-34 was forged in total war. The Strvm/42 was built for a war that never came. The difference shows in every specification. Even the American M4 Sherman, often criticized as inadequate against German armor, outclasses the Swedish design. Better armor, better gun, better mobility, better reliability, production capacity that could replace losses faster than they occurred. The Strvm/42 was never meant to compete with these machines on equal terms. It was meant to make an invasion of Sweden costly enough that Hitler would look elsewhere. In that narrow mission, perhaps simply by existing, it succeeded. The war ends, the tanks remain. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the Strvm/42 continues in Swedish service, now defending against a Soviet threat rather than a German one. But technology accelerates. The Swedish army recognizes that riveted armor and low-velocity guns belong to a previous era. They begin developing the Strv-74, a more modern design with welded armor and a more powerful gun. The M/42 becomes a training vehicle, teaching new generations of Swedish tankers the fundamentals before they graduate to more capable machines. By the early 1950s, most are withdrawn from frontline service. A handful remain active until 1957, making the Strvm/42 service life just 15 years. No heroic last stand, no glorious final battle, just quiet retirement to storage depots and scrapyards. Some are converted to armored personnel carriers, turrets removed, troop compartments installed. Others become recovery vehicles. Most are simply scrapped, their steel recycled into peacetime products. Today, perhaps 10 examples survive, a few in Swedish military museums preserved as reminders of a dangerous time when Swedish independence hung in balance. Others in private collections maintained by enthusiasts who appreciate engineering born from desperation. The Strvm/42 appears in no Hollywood films. It features in few video games. Military historians writing about World War II armor rarely mention it because it never fought in World War II. It is the definition of a forgotten war machine. Yet perhaps that forgetting is itself a victory. The Strvm/42 achieved exactly what Sweden needed. Not glory, not conquest, not a combat record written in blood, just deterrence, just survival, just enough strength to remain neutral in a world on fire. 282 tanks that never fought a war, defending a nation that never became a battlefield. If you want more stories of the weapons time forgot, the machines that shaped history from the shadows, subscribe and join us as we uncover the forgotten war relics of the 20th century.